A woman got into my back seat one night in Nashville and told me, in a voice that didn't sound scared so much as certain, that if I didn't drive faster, something bad was going to happen. 3 days later, she was gone, and the something bad had already happened before I ever had the chance to understand what she meant. My name is Tom Riley. I've driven for a living in Nashville for almost 12 years. Cabs first, then rideshare once that took over, and in that time I've had every kind of passenger you can imagine. Drunk ones, silent ones who cried in the back seat over things I never found out about, ones who talked my ear off about nothing in particular for 20 straight minutes. In all that time, there's exactly one ride I still think about more nights than I don't, and it started on a Tuesday in September, a warm night, the kind where the windows stay down even after dark. I picked her up outside a restaurant on Music Row called Bellamy's, a nice place, the kind where you valet park if you can afford to. Her name was Jessica Hart. She was standing at the curb alone when I pulled up. No jacket, arms crossed tight against herself even though it wasn't cold, and she got in before I'd even fully stopped the car. "Just go," she said. "Please, just go now." I asked where to. She gave me an address in a neighborhood called Sylvan Park, maybe 10 minutes away, and then she twisted around in her seat to look out the back window, and stayed like that for almost 30 full seconds before she turned back around. "Is everything okay?" I asked her. "Can you drive faster?" She said. "I know you're not supposed to. I know there's a speed limit. I don't care right now. Please." I looked in my mirror at the road behind us. There was a car, a grey sedan, 3 or 4 lengths back, that had pulled out from the restaurant's side street right after we did. I couldn't tell you the model even now, all these years later, something mid-size and unremarkable, the kind of car you'd never notice unless you had a reason to. I picked up speed anyway, because a woman that frightened in my back seat was reason enough, speed limit or not. "Is that car following us?" I asked her. She didn't answer right away. She kept watching the mirror on her side of the car, the little convex one, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something quieter, like she didn't want whoever was out there to somehow hear her through the glass. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe. I've thought that about a few cars tonight." I took 2 turns I wouldn't normally take on that route, cutting through a side street, and then doubling back towards Sylvan Park a different way than the GPS wanted, mostly because I'd been driving that city long enough to know a few shortcuts, and because something about her fear had gotten into me by then too. She kept twisting around to check behind us the entire time, her hand braced against the door, and at one point she said, quietly, almost to herself, "He said he'd never let me disappear from him. I thought he was being dramatic when he said it." She said it fast, like the words had been sitting behind her teeth for weeks, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I asked her who he was. She shook her head fast, like the question itself was dangerous. "It doesn't matter right now," she said. "Just get me home." I glanced in the mirror every few seconds after that, half watching the road and half watching for that same grey shape reappearing behind us, my hands tighter on the wheel than they needed to be for the actual speed we were going. For a stretch of about 90 seconds after the second turn, I genuinely thought we'd lost it entirely, and something in my chest loosened enough that I almost said so out loud. Then, 3 blocks later, I caught a flash of headlights turning onto the same street behind us from a side road, and Jessica saw my face change in the mirror before I said a word. "Is it back?" she said, not really a question. "I don't know," I told her honestly. "Could be anybody." The grey sedan didn't follow either turn. By the time we pulled onto her street, there was nothing behind us at all, just an ordinary quiet block with porch lights and parked cars, and no sign of anyone watching. She thanked me at the door of a small brick house near the end of the block, tipped generously, apologized for scaring me, and told me she'd probably just been paranoid, that she'd had a bad breakup a few months earlier and it had left her jumpy about things that were probably nothing. I told her there was nothing to apologize for, that a nervous passenger was hardly the worst thing that had ever happened in my back seat, and she managed a small, tired laugh at that before getting out of the car. I watched her walk all the way up her front steps and let herself inside before I pulled away, the way I always did. The porch light was on. The door closed behind her. Everything about that moment looked, to me, like a woman who had made it home safe. 3 days later, her face was on the local news. I want to be honest about those 3 days in between, because I've thought about them more than almost anything else in this story. I didn't call anyone after dropping her off. I didn't have a reason to. She'd made it inside. The porch light was on. The street was quiet. And by every measure I had available to me that night, the danger, whatever it had actually been, was over. I went home, told my wife about the strange ride over dinner the way you tell someone about any unusual fare, a story to share, and then sat down, and I didn't think about Jessica Hart again until her photograph filled my phone screen 3 mornings later. Missing, the headline said. Jessica Hart, 29, last seen at her home in Sylvan Park. No sign of forced entry. Family grew concerned when she missed 2 days of work without calling in, something her co-workers said she had never once done in 4 years at her job. Police were treating the case as suspicious. I sat in my kitchen with my coffee going cold in front of me, staring at a photo of a woman I'd driven exactly 1 time, and felt something close to what I imagined falling through ice must feel like. That specific, sudden drop, where the ground you thought was solid simply isn't there anymore, where every ordinary assumption you'd made about how that night ended turns out to have been wrong the entire time. I called the department that morning. I told the officer who answered everything I could remember: the restaurant, the grey sedan, the 2 turns I'd taken to lose it, the way she'd looked out the back window like she expected something to be there. He asked me to come in that afternoon, and Detective Sarah Bennett took my statement in full, twice, once informally over coffee in a break room that smelled faintly of burnt toast, and once on the record, with a recorder running on the table between us, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad the entire time I talked. You said grey sedan, Bennett repeated back to me, tapping her pen against a legal pad. Anything more specific? Make, model, plate, anything at all? I told her I'd already gone over it in my head probably 50 times since the news broke that morning, trying to squeeze more detail out of a memory that had happened fast, in bad light, while I was more focused on the road than on the car behind me. Bennett didn't seem frustrated by that. She told me most witnesses remember less than they think they will, and more than they think they can, and that the job was mostly about patiently pulling out the second kind of memory without accidentally planting the first kind. I didn't have much. Mid-size, grey, maybe 4 doors, headlights that seemed a little dimmer than most cars on the road that night, which made me think, without any real evidence, that one of them might have been out. I'd caught 2 digits of the plate in my mirror during one of the turns, a 7, and what I thought was an R, though I told Bennett straight out that I wouldn't stake anything on that R. It could easily have been a P or a B in that lighting. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in a case with no witnesses and no forced entry, something mattered more than I understood at the time. Bennett told me, over the following weeks, that Jessica's ex-boyfriend, a man named Craig Mercer, had immediately become the department's primary focus. They'd dated for almost 2 years, on and off, and had broken up for good roughly 4 months before she went missing, after what Jessica's closest friend described to police as an increasingly controlling relationship that had started to frighten her toward the end. Friends described a man who kept careful track of Jessica's schedule long after they'd broken up, who showed up at restaurants she'd mentioned in passing conversations weeks earlier, who once left a message on her voicemail, calm and almost pleasant in tone, saying that he didn't think she understood yet how much he still considered her his responsibility to look after. Nothing in any of it rose to the level of an actual crime on its own. Taken together, Bennett said, it painted a picture that made everyone on the case deeply uneasy without ever quite giving them enough to act on. Craig had a key to her old apartment from when they'd lived together briefly, though Jessica had moved to the Sylvan Park house afterwards specifically, her friend said, to put distance between them and start fresh with new locks nobody but her had a copy of. Except, it turned out somebody did. A locksmith record search found that Craig had ordered a duplicate key cut at a hardware store in Franklin, roughly 6 weeks before Jessica disappeared, using a spare he claimed, when confronted, belonged to his own apartment. The hardware store's own systems couldn't confirm or deny which key it actually was, because duplicate cutting doesn't leave that kind of trail, only a receipt and a date. It was suspicious. It wasn't proof. Craig had an alibi for the night Jessica went missing, an alibi that held up under 2 rounds of scrutiny. He'd been at a work conference in Memphis, badge scans and hotel check-in, confirming his location 300 miles away. Bennett told me, months later, over coffee near her precinct, that the alibi was airtight enough that it effectively removed him as a suspect for the actual night of the disappearance, even though nobody on the case, herself included, ever fully stopped believing he was connected to it somehow. Airtight alibis for the day something happens don't mean airtight alibis for the day it was planned, she told me. Somebody had to be in that house that night. It just apparently wasn't him. That detail sat with me for years afterward, the idea that a man could arrange something terrible from 300 miles away and never once have to be present for the worst of it. I met Jessica's mother, Jessica Hart, about 3 weeks into the investigation. She reached out to me directly after seeing my name mentioned, briefly and without much detail, in a local news follow-up about the mystery grey sedan. She wanted to hear the ride described to her firsthand, in my own words, the way parents in these situations often do, hunting for some small detail that might mean something to her that it hadn't meant to a detective. I told her everything, the restaurant, the fear in Jessica's voice. Just go, please, just go, now. The way she'd watched the mirror on her side of the car like she expected the worst thing in the world to appear in it at any second. Linda sat across from me in her kitchen and cried in the specific, exhausted way of someone who had already been crying for 3 weeks straight and simply had no other setting left to switch to. She called me the week before, Linda told me, said she thought someone had been outside her house a couple times. I told her to call the police. She said she didn't have anything to report, just a feeling. I told her feelings matter. I don't think she believed me. That conversation became the first of what would eventually total, across the following 11 years, dozens of coffees, dozens of phone calls, dozens of anniversaries neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but both of us always did anyway. Linda and I weren't friends exactly, not in any way either of us would have chosen under different circumstances, but we were bound to the same unanswered question, and there weren't many people left who understood the particular weight of that question the way we understood it for each other. Linda told me once, around year 5, that she'd started attending a support group for families of long-term missing persons that met monthly in a church basement across town, a group she'd resisted joining for years because she said walking into a room full of people whose loved ones were also gone felt, at first, like giving up on the idea that Jessica's case might end differently than theirs. She said it took her almost 2 years to understand that the room wasn't about giving up at all. It was about not carrying the weight entirely alone, and that some of the friendships she built there, with parents and spouses and siblings living inside the exact same unfinished sentence, became some of the steadiest relationships in her life during those years. The grey sedan never turned into anything solid. The partial plate, a 7 and a possible R, matched thousands of vehicles registered across Tennessee, and without a make or model to narrow the search, Bennett's team ran down leads for months, without a single one holding up. A grey sedan seen on a gas station camera 2 miles from Jessica's house that same night, time-stamped close enough to matter, turned out to belong to a delivery driver with a clean alibi and no connection to anyone involved. Another lead, a witness who claimed to have seen a similar car parked on Jessica's street earlier that week, couldn't produce anything beyond a vague memory that dissolved further every time detectives asked her to be more specific. By year 2, the file had gone the way these files go: fewer calls from reporters, fewer updates from Bennett, not because she'd stopped caring, she told me more than once, but because there was simply nothing new to report, and false hope dressed up as an update helps no one. There were other leads scattered through those early years that never went anywhere, the way there always are in cases like this. A woman matching Jessica's description was reported working at a truck stop diner outside Knoxville in year 1, and Linda drove 3 hours on nothing but a grainy phone photo, only to find a waitress who looked nothing like her daughter once she saw her in person. A tip came in during year 3 from someone who claimed to have seen Craig Mercer meeting a heavyset stranger in a parking lot outside Chattanooga, a detail Bennett's team chased for months, interviewing every heavyset man with any connection to Craig they could locate, without ever confirming the sighting meant anything at all. Linda kept a small memorial garden going in her backyard, a patch of daylilies Jessica had loved as a kid, and every September, on the anniversary, she'd send me a photo of them blooming, like proof that something, at least, kept coming back every year, even if her daughter didn't. I kept driving. I avoided Bellamy's for a long stretch, the way you avoid a place that used to just be a restaurant and now feels like the beginning of something you can't undo. I switched to daytime shifts for almost 3 years after Jessica disappeared, something my wife suggested gently, not because she thought I was in danger, but because she noticed I'd stopped sleeping properly on the nights I worked late, replaying a 5-minute drive through Sylvan Park that never seemed to end the same reassuring way twice in my head. The break, when it finally came, arrived 11 years later, and it didn't come from Bennett's department at all. It came from a hiking party nearly 200 miles east, in a remote stretch of the Cherokee National Forest, who found a woman walking alone along a fire access road at dusk, disoriented, malnourished, wearing clothes that looked decades out of style even though they weren't, unable at first to tell the rangers who found her what year it was. It took 3 days of hospital care and careful, patient questioning before anyone confirmed what the rangers had begun to suspect, almost immediately from her description alone. Doctors at the hospital in Irwin, Tennessee, treated her for severe malnutrition, several partially healed fractures that appeared to have gone untreated for months at a time, and a level of psychological distress that the attending psychiatrist later described, in a statement to the department, as consistent with prolonged isolation and coercive control extending across many years rather than months. She gave her name to a nurse on the second day, quietly, almost testing the sound of it out loud after so long, and the nurse, who happened to have grown up in Nashville, recognized it immediately from a missing persons case she remembered from more than a decade earlier. The woman was Jessica Hart. I heard about it the same way most of Nashville did, from a news alert on my phone on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, and I had to pull my car over on the shoulder of I-40 because my hands weren't steady enough to keep driving. Linda called me that same night, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from her, across 11 years of shared grief. They found her, she kept saying, like she needed to hear herself say it out loud enough times before her body would believe it. Tom, they found her. She's alive. I didn't meet Jessica in person until almost a month later, once doctors and a careful team of trauma specialists had decided she was ready for visitors beyond immediate family. We met at Linda's kitchen table, the same table where Linda had once described feelings that mattered to a daughter who hadn't believed her. Jessica looked older than 11 years should have made her, thinner, her hair threaded with grey that had no business being there yet, but her eyes, when she looked at me, were unmistakably the same eyes that had watched a side mirror in the back of my cab like her life depended on it, because, it turned out, it had. She was quiet for the first several minutes of that visit, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place until she finally spoke. I used to think about that car ride constantly, she said, in the cabin. It became this whole story I told myself, that maybe you'd noticed something, maybe you'd remembered the license plate, maybe someone was going to knock on the door any day because of what you saw. I built entire days around that hope sometimes. I told her I'd given the department everything I had, the 2 turns, the partial plate, the make I couldn't fully identify, and that I'd spent 11 years wondering whether any of it had actually mattered, or whether I'd simply imagined a threat that was never really there. She reached across the table and took my hand, briefly, the first time either of us had touched since that September night, 11 years earlier. It mattered, she said. Even when it felt like nothing was happening, it mattered. You were the last person who believed me before the worst thing happened. I held on to that longer than I probably should have. It kept something in me alive that I don't think would have survived otherwise. She told me the whole story slowly, over that visit and 2 more that followed, piecing it together the way trauma sometimes lets a person do only once they finally feel safe enough to remember, in order. Craig Mercer hadn't been in Memphis planning nothing that night. He'd hired someone, a man Jessica never learned the real name of, someone Craig knew through a cousin with a record, to take her from her house, while Craig's own alibi kept him 300 miles clean. The man had gotten in through the duplicated key, waited in her house until she was asleep, and driven her, sedated and terrified, to a cabin Craig owned under a shell company near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, remote enough that no search grid drawn around Sylvan Park would have ever reached it. She spent 11 years in that cabin and the surrounding property, moved twice over the years to smaller, more isolated buildings, as Craig grew more paranoid about discovery, controlled through years of psychological conditioning that Jessica, even now, has trouble fully putting into words for people who haven't lived through something like it. She told me the first year had been the hardest to survive, not physically but mentally, that she'd spent months convinced someone would find her any day, checking a small window at the same time every morning for a search helicopter that never came, until slowly, unbearably, that certainty wore down into something closer to acceptance, and acceptance, she said, had frightened her even more than the fear had, because it felt like losing the last part of herself that still believed rescue was possible. Craig visited rarely, she said, sometimes not for months at a stretch, leaving her under the watch of the man who'd taken her, whom she came to know only as Ray, a man who, in the strange arithmetic of a situation like that, became at various points both her captor and the only human being she saw for weeks on end. The escape happened almost by accident. Ray had suffered what Jessica believes now was a stroke, collapsing suddenly one afternoon while checking the cabin's perimeter fence, and in the chaos and fear of that moment, Jessica realized the gate had been left unlatched for the first time in longer than she could remember. She stood over him for what felt like a long time, she told me, torn between an instinct to help a man who had also been, in his own strange way, her only human contact for years, and a competing instinct screaming at her that this gate would never be open again if she didn't move now. She chose the gate. She has told me since that she doesn't know, and may never know, whether Ray survived that afternoon, and that the not knowing sits alongside everything else she carries from those 11 years, complicated in a way she isn't sure she'll ever fully untangle. She didn't plan the walk that followed. She simply started walking, in the wrong shoes, with no real sense of direction, following what she hoped was downhill, because downhill, she reasoned, eventually reaches water, and water eventually reaches people. She kept walking for almost 2 full days, sleeping in brief stretches against tree trunks, drinking from a creek she found on the first afternoon, before the hiking party found her at dusk on the second day, sitting on a fallen log along a fire access road, too exhausted to call out to them until they were almost past her. Craig Mercer was arrested within a week, once Jessica's account, corroborated by physical evidence recovered from the property, including, eventually, security footage backups Craig had never thought to fully destroy, gave investigators more than enough to move on him at last. The property records led investigators to 2 other structures Craig had quietly purchased through shell companies over the years, one of which showed clear signs of having held Jessica during an earlier stretch of her captivity, complete with a mattress on the floor and a chain bolted to a support beam that technicians would later confirm matched marks found on evidence recovered from her body during her hospital examination. Prosecutors ultimately charged Craig with kidnapping, aggravated assault, and a long list of related counts that, taken together, carried a sentence Bennett described to reporters as effectively the rest of his natural life, however long that life turned out to be. Detective Bennett, retired by then but brought back in as a consultant given her history with the case, told reporters it was the single most satisfying arrest of her entire career, 11 years delayed but complete, in a way she'd stopped allowing herself to believe was possible. She told me privately, over one last coffee near her old precinct, that she still kept a printed copy of Jessica's original missing persons flyer in a drawer at home, and that she planned to keep it there for the rest of her life, not as a reminder of failure, but as proof that some cases, given enough patience and enough luck, eventually find their way to an ending nobody had any right to expect anymore. I asked Jessica once, near the end of our third visit, whether she remembered the ride at all, the 2 turns I'd taken through Sylvan Park, trying to lose a car that might have been nothing. I remember all of it, she told me. I think about it more than almost anything else from before. Not because anything went wrong that night, because for those 10 minutes, someone actually listened to me. Nobody else did, not really. Not until it was already too late. You just heard me say drive faster, and you drove faster. I don't think I ever thanked you properly for that. I told her she didn't need to. I told her I'd spent 11 years wishing there had been something more I could have done than take 2 extra turns through a quiet neighborhood, and that hearing her say it had mattered at all was more than I'd let myself hope for in longer than I could remember. She shook her head at that, gently, the way someone does when they've had a long time to think through exactly this response and finally found the right words for it. You can't spend the rest of your life wishing you'd done more with information you didn't have, she said. I've had 11 years in a cabin to think about wishing. It doesn't fix anything. It just takes up space where something better could be living instead. Linda's daylilies are still blooming every September, and this year, for the first time in 11 years, Jessica was there to see them bloom herself, sitting beside her mother in the same backyard where Linda used to photograph them alone and send the picture to a cab driver who had become, without either of them planning it, one of the few people who understood exactly how long 11 years of waiting actually feels. Jessica told me she started her own small garden bed at the edge of Linda's yard. Nothing fancy yet, mostly things she remembers from before, and that watching something grow on a schedule she controls herself has become, in a strange and quiet way, one of the more healing parts of the last year. She's begun seeing a trauma specialist twice a week in Nashville, someone experienced with survivors of prolonged captivity, and she told me the hardest part some days isn't remembering the 11 years at all, it's relearning ordinary things everyone else takes for granted. How to order at a restaurant without flinching when a waiter approaches the table too quickly. How to sleep with a window open. How to trust that a locked door will still be locked in the morning. Linda sits with her through most of it, she said, in the same patient way she waited through 11 years of nothing, only now with something to actually wait for. I still drive the same streets through Sylvan Park most weeks, the same shortcut I took that night, without fully knowing why it might matter. I don't know if those 2 turns actually lost whoever might have been behind us, or if the grey sedan was nothing at all, some unrelated driver heading somewhere unremarkable on an ordinary Tuesday night. I'll probably never know which version of that memory is the true one, but I know that a woman once begged me to drive faster, and I did, and 11 years later she was still alive to tell me it had mattered, and some nights, driving that same familiar street, that's the only answer I actually need.